Yeah. Yeah. Well, the easy answer is just to be doing what everyone's doing. But to say that another way, it would be to start life to become insulin resistant as early as possible in life. Becoming insulin resistant as a child, which happens more and more around the world, truly around the world. China, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North America. We always think in North America that we're the worst, that we're the fattest, sickest, and we're not. In fact, we're not even in the top 20 when it comes to these problems that we're speaking about. But it's a global problem. So become insulin resistant as early as possible in your youth, which will start driving greater hunger because insulin and leptin will be disrupted centrally at the hypothalamus, promoting greater hunger. So satiety will go down. It will be focusing on more processed foods, which will be protein deficient. Everyone in this space, and a lot of people we've discussed would agree that is a lot of the problem as protein goes down. That will facilitate greater hunger or reduced satiety. And that will mean eating more and more processed foods. So the basic, every meal essentially is coming from bags and boxes with barcodes, which is a wonderful way to get a lot of refined carbohydrates to spike insulin and a lot of refined oils to fuel unhealthy fat cell growth. And in the process, these insulin-resistant children will be sedentary, living a life either because of school or because of difficult, parents not engaging them, ideally, or living in communities where it's not safe or practical to be engaging in a lot of outdoor activity. But they will be vitamin D deficient. They will be losing muscle mass when they should be growing it during their childhood and adolescent years, making it difficult to control glucose for the reasons that we mentioned earlier. And then underlying all of this process of becoming overweight and sick at a very early age, developing hypertension and diabetes in their teens, increasing the risk of heart disease, cancers, and dementia, increasing the economic and lifespan burden in a society. But underlying all of it is this disease of, family and even morality, where we are losing the moral foundation that helped people have this sense of pride in being something unique and something special with, I would say, a bit of divinity in every person that is worthy of capitalizing and growing. So there's this loss of, sort of spiritual sense and even a common sense of morality across societies that used to anchor everyone together. So maybe to say that all another way, is this loss of connection. That might be a more sort of palatable way to explain it. That once upon a time we had these units within communities that really fostered connections with other individuals, certainly within the home and outside the home. And I think all of these variables come together, and it's the increasing isolation, killing people emotionally and perhaps even a little intellectually, and then of course the destruction of the physical body by embracing a diet and a lifestyle with sleep deprivation in kids and the almost incessant consumption of processed foods that make children insulin resistant before they ever reach 10, and then in their teens they get type 2 diabetes. And then they're on multiple medications by the time they're 20, that once upon a time were medications for someone who was 80, so we're getting fatter, sicker, and we're aging faster, all while we're getting more miserable by losing the social connections that were once so prevalent within communities. Yeah, I wish that there were firm consensus with regards to fasting insulin, like we have with so many other markers. There isn't. And the ranges will vary almost from lab to lab. Someone could, if they convince their clinician to get their fasting insulin measured, it's entirely possible that the lab will say anything under 15 microunits per mil is normal. And I blanch at that idea. I think that's way too high. So with a little bit of scrutiny in the evidence, digging through the evidence, my conclusion is that if someone has a fasting insulin of 6 microunits per mil or less, it's a very, very good sign that the body is insulin sensitive. In other words, you only need a modest amount of insulin to get the job done. Whatever insulin needs to do. And insulin does a lot of things because, as a reminder to the audience, literally every single cell of the body is responsive to insulin. Or to say that another way, every cell has insulin receptors, these little docking sites for insulin to come and dock onto the cell and then tell the cell to do something. And there are all kinds of somethings that insulin will tell the cell to do. depending on the cell. So measure the fasting insulin, hopefully less than 6 microunits per mil. That to me is a very, very good sign. If it's if it's around say 7 to 17 or so, that's a warning. And I know that's a bit of a big range, but it's just hard to know in that range whether you are consistently at say 15 or whether you are consistently at 5 and you just happen to have a peak in your insulin at that moment when you measured. And then anything above the high teens in insulin, I would say, is almost guaranteed to be a problem. And that's why, as much as I am a great advocate of measuring insulin, I also don't ever mean to imply that it's the only marker. That I think there are other scores, like, for example, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Take triglycerides fasted, divide by HDL fasted, and that number, it varies a little bit across ethnicities, but the kind of average point appears to be around 1.5. So get your fasting insulin measured, absolutely, but also couple that with your triglyceride to HDL ratio. And if that number is less than 1.5, it's a very good sign that you're insulin sensitive. Even if your insulin creeped up into the teens, don't lose hope. Look at that number, and that'll help fill in some details. And the value of that number is, in the event that anyone listening is not able to convince their clinician to measure their insulin, because let's face it, it's not easy to do. It's often a bit of a battle to get it done. You will always get your triglyceride to HDL ratio measured, or not even the ratio, but those two numbers. Every blood test will include triglycerides. Every blood test will include HDL cholesterol. So take that ratio, just compute it on your own. And if it's less than 1.5, then you can be really confident that your fasting insulin is also going to be good. Yeah, we can start with the one that appears to have the greater mass appeal, which would be calories, or what I would like to refer to as just energy, or sufficient energy. So you must have sufficient energy in the body, coming into the body, in order to provide the fuel for the growth of the fat cell. However, what is too often overlooked is the absolute requirement of elevated insulin. A fat cell does not inherently know what to do with the energy that it has surrounding it. And we are regularly growing fat cells on little petri dishes. And it is so stark to look at the difference in the way the fat cells behave in the absence or later the presence of insulin. So as we are growing the fat cells out across this little plate, they are surrounded with energy, calories. There's fat and there's glucose, which are the two building blocks for triglycerides within the fat cell itself. The triglycerides, which are kind of giving the fat cell its big fat blob, or what we call a lipid droplet. And so again, the fat cells are surrounded by calories, an abundance of energy, and yet they're small. There's no changes on those fat cells until we start sprinkling in insulin into the culture, into the bath, the medium, we call it, the liquid that the cells are bathing in. Once we start putting in insulin, now the fat cells know what to do, which is store the energy. So that's a part that's so often overlooked. And this doesn't apply to all metabolism in all cells, but it is a pretty central theme that cells need to be told what to do with the energy they have available. Whether it's energy available on the outside to come in, or whether it's energy that the cell already has available within itself. It's the hormones. It's hormones like insulin or glucagon or epinephrine, adrenaline, and others, growth hormone, that signal to the cell what to do with the energy that it has access to. The cell doesn't just know what to do with the energy. The hormones are what's sort of sampling the entire body, understanding what's going on in the entire body, and then dictating individual cells. You know, it's like the hormones are the conductor to the orchestra. And when it comes to fat cell growth, you have on one side the hormone insulin, which is overwhelmingly promoting the growth of the fat cell. And it is so powerful in its own right that it is offset by multiple other hormones that tend to have a catabolic effect to insulin's anabolic effect. Like some of the other ones I mentioned, glucagon and epinephrine, most obviously, and growth hormone. So there are a handful of hormones that are trying to get the fat cell to shrink and share its energy, all to try to offset the incredible power of insulin, which is telling the fat cell to store energy. But insulin goes even further than that. As much as insulin has a very pronounced central effect on, or directed effect on, fat cells to stimulate their growth, insulin also has effects at the brain, stimulating to some degree of appetite or satiety, in various instances. Not to mention the effect that insulin has on leptin levels from the fat cells. Again, a direct effect at the fat cell. But insulin will also elicit a whole body effect to slow metabolic rate. We have known that for decades. Indeed, over 100 years ago, two famous Harvard scientists, Elliot P. Joslin and Francis G. Benedict, came together to try to understand the metabolism in what they called severe diabetes, which we would just say kind of uncontrolled type 1 diabetes. That they noted in these individuals who have no insulin, their metabolic rate was 20 to 30% higher than it should be. There was something uncontrolled, this fire just raging through their body. You must have elevated insulin to signal the growth of fat cell, and you must have sufficient energy to fuel the growth of the fat cell. Either is insufficient. You need both. I worry that the term excess implies a need to kind of be accounting for calories. And as much as I agree that calories do matter, I'm very readily admitting that. I think that if we attempt to quantify them and count them, we're doomed. And I can sort of revisit that idea later. Part of my beef with the caloric view of obesity is this, what I consider absolute fallacy, that we can account for calories, where we cannot. The human body, to invoke terms of physics, after all, and I can do that because even invoking calories and energy is invoking terms of physics. The human body is an open system. We are not a closed system. We cannot account for every movement of energy, whether we would call it a calorie or not, into and out of the body. For example, if insulin is low, caloric rate goes up. And I mentioned earlier the studies of Joslin and Benedict quantifying metabolic rate in untreated type 1 diabetes. The metabolic rate was 20 or 30% too high. That's literally because the energy, the metabolic machinery is burning hotter. The engine is idling at a higher rate, but also in the same instance where insulin is low and now the body is burning so much fat that it can't stop burning fat, because in the absence of insulin, fat burning goes unchecked. That the body is burning more fat than it needs to meet its energetic needs, and thus the excess starts to become ketones. So ketones are simply a product of, if you will, excess fat burning. And now when we start making ketones, every ketone has a caloric value roughly comparable to glucose. Most people don't appreciate that. And if insulin is low enough that we're burning a lot of fat, then we start burning more fat and turning it into ketones. Now when we're making ketones, we are dumping the ketones out of our bodies into the atmosphere. Whether we're breathing the ketones out or whether we are urinating them out, every ketone has a caloric value that, based on the caloric kind of view of obesity, we need to account for as we're counting calories, trying to get into a caloric deficit or whatever the outcome may be that we want. We cannot quantify the potentially hundreds of calories in a 24-hour period that are just being dumped back into the atmosphere in the form of our breath or our urine. And so that's another reason I grimace a little bit when people too staunchly advocate for a caloric view. Calories will sort of take care of itself if the hormones are in order. You really can't appreciate whole body insulin resistance without appreciating the origins of it, which I believe are very firmly at the fat cell. There are, every tissue is responsive to insulin, and as it becomes insulin resistant or not would contribute to whole body insulin resistance. But in your case, we have a guy whose fasting insulin levels are good. My counter would be, what were your insulin levels throughout the day when you aren't fasted? That's where I think we have to appreciate this. And that's where so many people have the problem, where we have such a culture of carbohydrate heavy foods and eating so frequently that the average individual, certainly when Drew and Ben are on vacation, spends almost every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And we're still insulin sensitive enough that after a 12-hour fast, our insulin comes down. But what happens in those other 12 hours during the day, or more than 12 hours, depending on what we eat before we go to bed, when our insulin is elevated? That is how we can gain weight and yet still have a nice fasted insulin number, again, when we are fasted. But the net effect, there was a paper published in Humans that had people overeat carbohydrates for 7 days. So it was a high carbohydrate diet for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, the fasted insulin was 2.5 times higher. So I would say the bill comes due that maybe that you or I, in your case, because you were measuring your fasted insulin so readily, it wasn't enough to actually start promoting a more lingering insulin resistance, but we know it happens. This just in as short as 1 week, the fasted insulin went from around 5 microunits per mil up to high teens in these people. Again, in a fasted state. And that just means in that case, even when you are fasted, you have gone into the realm of what scientists at University of Pittsburgh identified years ago called metabolic inflexibility, which is basically just you're insulin resistant and your body now is having a hard time shifting to fat burning, even when you're fasted, even when you should have gone to fat burning. The body's a hybrid, burning glucose or fats primarily. And insulin is the switch that determines which fuel the body's using. And so that is, again, when fat gain would start to amplify, where you're not only gaining fat during the day, but you're potentially not turning to fat burning during the night, when you should be, which would be helping with some degree of fat loss. You're still potentially storing fat even when the body wants to be burning it. When I did my postdoctoral work in Singapore, one of the reasons Singapore was so interested in partnering with Duke University, which is where I was to understand these ethnic differences on how you can take ethnicities, particularly in Singapore, with both Chinese, South Asian, Malaysian, and European. And you have these 4 different guys who are best drinking buddies, and they're all gaining weight, and yet they start to suffer the consequences of that weight gain at very different rates. But a study done in Caucasians compared to South Asians, not only do we know that the average South Asian Indian has a fasted insulin that is more than double what his Caucasian counterpart is, but also, even at the same body weight, his fat cells are about 3 to 4 times larger than his Caucasian counterpart. And there are these, and this could explain why partly India has more people with type 2 diabetes, absolute numbers more than anyone, but of course India's population is so massive. Even per capita, it's approaching the number 1 spot in the world, being truly the diabetes capital of the world. And a part of it is this combination, yes, environment, diet matters, but also genetics. That based on our genetics and partly our diet, certain bodies have the potential to store fat in their fat cells to varying levels. As long as you can continue to store fat in fat cells, the body stays metabolically sound. And that it's once the fat cells start to reach a point of maximum dimension, and by that I mean every individual fat cell is getting too big, now the body has reached its threshold. And if insulin is attempting to still tell the body to store energy, now you have a war, a metabolic mutiny, where the fat cell starts to rebel. We gain fat through 2 different processes. Because of our unique ethnicity and the genetics that come with that, some of my weight gain potentially would have happened through some modest degree of hyperplasia, where when my fat cells started to get a little big, I would simply create some new fat cells. Whereas Drew, with South Asian ethnicity, your fat cells, you have a very limited potential for hyperplasia. In other words, you're not going to multiply your fat cells. The number of fat cells is pretty set. So then what happens is the fat cells each just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So each fat cell is carrying a bigger metabolic load than it would normally. Whereas again, in another body that can undergo hyperplasia, the fat cell gets a little big and it recruits a new fat cell, which gets a little big. So more important than the mass of fat we have on our body is the size of each individual fat cell. When the fat cell gets really, really big, two problems start to happen. One, it starts to reach a point of maximum dimension that it can't grow anymore. Otherwise, the cell membrane starts to lose its integrity and literally start to pop, which would be a very messy, inflammatory process. And at the second, the fat cell, as it's swollen up to 10 or 20 times bigger than it used to be, is now suffocating. It's getting pushed too far from capillaries. In other words, blood vessels where it can get oxygen and give it CO2 and get nutrients. So the fat cell starts to get too big and it starts to suffocate. When the fat cell starts to get so big, it starts to tell insulin, you are trying to make me big and yet I can't grow anymore. And so while you are trying to block me from breaking down my fat, I'm not listening and I'm going to start leaking fats. To say that in a more precise term, insulin normally inhibits lipolysis, which is the term for breaking down fat. That's the primary mechanism whereby insulin promotes the growth of a fat cell, not necessarily force feeding it, but preventing it from breaking it down. So the fat cell says, insulin, fats are still coming in or glucose is still coming in, but now I'm going to start breaking down fat even though you're trying to tell me not to. So one, the fat cell, the hypertrophic or swollen fat cell becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth, leaking free fatty acids into the blood in the midst of elevated insulin. And those two things should not be high at the same time. High insulin and high free fatty acids now means you're going to start storing fat in other places throughout the body, most especially the liver, getting fatty liver and excess fat in the pancreas, creating insulin resistance in those tissues. But the second problem, as I mentioned, is that the fat cell becomes hypoxic. It starts to suffocate, if you will, as it's gotten pushed too far from the capillary. The fat cell has a potential solution for that too, and that is by secreting a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines into the bloodstream. So the hypertrophic fat cell becomes very pro-inflammatory because some of those cytokines that it's secreting have the ability to promote the growth of new capillaries. And so it starts to correct its hypoxia by stimulating the growth of new fat cells, which is a better outcome than suffocating and becoming necrotic. Once again, a very messy, inflamed death. I think calorie counting is doomed to fail because we simply cannot account for every calorie coming in, and you cannot account for every calorie going out. My view on weight loss is that you have two steps you can take to lose weight. One is a step to deliberately lower insulin, and the other is a step to deliberately lower energy coming in, or to lower calories. Too often, we take the first step with the low calorie step. And people just start cutting fat because that's the most calorie dense food, and they keep their carbohydrates as the main part of their diet. If a person is starting this weight loss journey and they're already insulin resistant or diabetic and they have high insulin, if the first step is low calorie, David Ludwig and other labs have shown this too, that if you just lower calories but insulin is staying high, the total amount of energy available, or the calorie-rich molecules in the blood, drops. So total energy availability goes down, and that stimulates greater hunger. So if you try to lose weight where you're cutting calories but you're not addressing the high insulin, insulin wants to tell the body to store energy. And so it's always pushing energy from the blood into cells. Well, the brain is uniquely suffering in that case because the brain doesn't have a lot of energy storage capacity, unlike the liver, which can store a few thousand calories as energy or glucose, unlike the fat cells, which can store hundreds of thousands of calories, or even muscle, which can store some thousands of calories in total. They have a little bit of reserve so that if the energy in the blood goes down, they can rely on their own energy for a time. So combined with the fact that the brain has essentially no energy storage in itself, and the fact that the brain has a very, very high metabolic rate, it makes the brain very, very sensitive to analyzing. It's kind of the energy thermostat, the calorostat in the body, where if energy starts to go down, the brain panics. It senses that and will say, hey, I'm gonna start running out of energy. I have two pathways ahead of me. I either shut down because the energy isn't sufficient to maintain my current level of activity, in other words, lose consciousness, or I'm going to make us eat more, which is to say it increases hunger. And so if someone starts their weight loss journey without addressing the insulin, keeping insulin high, but cutting calories, then my worry is that that is doomed to failure because hunger will win. Hosting this beautiful buffet, and we've invited the world's best chefs to come prepare the most delicious foods. It is an all-you-can-eat. We want to invite our friends and family to come enjoy this with us. We would tell them, come hungry because you're going to want to try everything. What would be the two things our friends and family would do to come as hungry as possible? They would eat a little less in the days before the event, and they would probably exercise a little harder. Those are the two very pieces of advice that modern weight loss science is built on. Eat less, exercise more. And yes, it will put you into a caloric deficit. It will shrink your fat cells, but it will be a temporary win because the more you're cutting energy in the midst of keeping insulin elevated without addressing insulin, you will go hungry. And sure enough, in this case, it worked. They come to the buffet as hungry as possible. But the problem is if our weight loss strategy is built on those same ideas, hunger always wins. I am an enormous advocate of protein and have been from the very, very early on. In fact, in the low carb community, I was very struck by people who were demonizing protein. In fact, I was so impressed in a negative way by these views that I gave a talk. One of my very first talks that people can still find on YouTube was me defending protein, referring to the insulin to glucagon ratio, and the differences of insulin response to protein in the context of a high carb diet and the difference in response to protein in the context of a low carb diet. And it is very, very different. The degree to which protein elicits or amino acids elicit an insulin response depends heavily on the underlying glycemia or the glucose that is coming with those amino acids in some instances. So I'm an enormous defender of protein and even advocate, which is why prioritize protein is one of my central dogmas when it comes to nutrition. The beauty of protein is that it is, I would say, calorically inert. I think that one of the problems with the thermodynamic view of obesity and this obsession with calories is that we assign calories to a class of macronutrient that is not a fuel. Protein is not a fuel. I don't think on any label you look at, protein should be counted as having a caloric load because it is all but it is a rare instance when you're relying on amino acids for energy. That is not common. It's not healthy. And again, thankfully, it's not common. So I think protein should be off the label. I mean, list it, sure, but don't give it a caloric value. That's not accurate. So because we don't use the energy for the protein for energy, we use it for a building block. Energy is glucose and fats. That's what we burn. Amino acids, even the rare instances when we are burning for energy, it is an incredibly modest amount, unless we get to true starvation. And that is the difference between fasting and starvation. The difference is, do you have fat to burn? Once you run out of fat and now you're in a caloric deficit, now you're burning muscle, relying on amino acids for energy, that is starvation. But I also think we should eat protein the way, if you'll pardon me for saying, invoking deity, the way God intended. In nature, protein always comes with fat. There is no exception to this. No exception. But in our hubris or our fear of fat, we have pulled the two apart. And now we have sources of just primarily protein. You know, people will invoke chicken, but look 100 years ago, people didn't really eat chicken. We kept the chickens around for their eggs, which are this perfect balance of 1-to-1 protein to fat. You look in the U.S., what's happened to chicken consumption since 1909, it was essentially zero. And now it is the single most common source of meat we eat. And I'm not trying to vilify chicken meat. I'm not. But I do think it's worth sort of wondering how we used to eat once upon a time when we weren't so afraid of fat. Chicken meat has fat. There is no such thing as protein in nature without fat. And that's why my third rule is don't fear fat. In other words, don't fear the fat that comes with the protein that you're attempting to prioritize. When we eat fat with protein, we digest the protein better. Most people just think of protein as having its own digestive pathway and fat as having its own digestive pathway, yet bile acids that are secreted when we eat fat only actually accelerate the proteolytic enzymes that are involved in protein digestion. We literally digest the protein better when the protein comes with fat.